let's, okay, so today we're going to start in on Unit 3. This is Chapter 7. I think the next 2 units are a little bit shorter in terms of chapters, so I think they're only 2 chapters each. So we'll actually speed up a little bit in terms of how frequently you're having tests. And the material is, there's a little less to cover, right? So I mean, obviously, like the first unit, we basically started in like 1492 and went all the way to like 1770. And then in the second unit, we backed up a little bit and then went through basically to 1800. Now what we're going to look at is Jeffersonian democracy. Really all we're going to cover for this unit is 1800 to basically the election of 1828. So in 1800, the United States is still a new nation, right? We're still an early country. The population of the United States at this point is still predominantly rural. And you'll see that's going to maintain, it's going to continue for a significant amount of time. We're founded as an agrarian nation, meaning a nation of farmers. We're going to remain a nation of farmers through the entire first semester of this class, right? Like we are a rural population, a rural nation until well after the Civil War, predominantly. What that means is the vast majority of our population, the majority of our people are farmers. That's their job, their industry, their career, their livelihood. But we do begin to see some economic growth in terms of some creations of a early capitalistic sort of market economy. So specifically, the textile industry is one of the really good examples. Y'all know what textiles are?
It's like, I don't know how to, I know what it is, I know what you're talking about, but I don't know how to explain it.
Clothing.
Yeah, I was going to say like cloth.
Cloth, yeah. Textiles are basically cloth. So textiles are essentially the creation of like fabric. And obviously there's different fabrics based upon whether you're using wool or cotton or whatever. But in the North, and again, it's the North that becomes more sort of market-based and capitalistic first. The North sets up textile mills. The South now, instead of having to ship raw goods and cotton and things like that to England, it's now beginning to ship those resources up to the New England area. New England also sees some sort of increases in construction. Again, I think we talked about this once before, the sort of shipbuilding industry in the New England area with all the trees up there. The U.S. sort of shifts at the beginning of Jefferson's presidency, or near the beginning of well, slightly before, with the creation of the District of Columbia, right? So Washington, D.C. is created. Again, it's sort of a compromise. You should understand that in U.S. history, we sit here and we watch the world today, and the world is the U.S., not the world. The U.S. is very divided. It's very contentious. I need you to understand that that's actually true of the United States in all sorts of periods of time for a long time. The District of Columbia is actually a compromise that resulted from regional conflict from very, very early on in our nation, right? Our capital had been further north, and so Maryland, which is sort of a middle colony, although the middle colonies in some regards are more New England type states than your southern states. So Maryland and Virginia both like give up a little bit of land And we developed the District of Columbia, and it's a federal city. Like, the District of Columbia exists outside of any state. It is not responsible to any state. It does not have senators. It does not have a representative in Congress. The mayor of Washington, D.C. is actually responsible directly to Congress, right? So like local D.C. government goes straight to the federal level because there's no state to oversee it. Jefferson's Jefferson's inauguration is the first time that we have a president inaugurated at what is the White House. It doesn't look exactly like the White House today because the War of 1812, which we'll cover in a little bit, the War of 1812, there's some destruction to the White House, and so parts of it have to be rebuilt. But this does create sort of Jeffersonian democracy or Jeffersonian republicanism. But Jefferson puts a significant stamp on government and how government functions in the United States. He is one of the more important presidents in terms of history, because the Federalists who had been in control prior to Jefferson's presidency, the Federalists are very, very much elitists, right? They believe that the wealthy, propertied, educated class in America is the one that should rule. Jefferson actually tries to spend a significant amount of his time highlighting the difference between sort of his Democratic Republicans and the Federalists, because the Democratic Republicans are sort of the everyday people. They are more layman's, they're simpler, more frugal, they're not nearly as formal. And so this is part of the reason why we call sort of Jefferson the people's president. He's trying to appeal more to the masses than what the Federalists do. It is important for you to note that Adams is a one-term president. He's elected in 96. He's defeated in 1800 by Jefferson. It's a very contentious election. It actually went to the House of Representatives because we didn't have a clear winner for president of the United States. It actually resulted in the 12th Amendment because there was no clear victor. But there is peaceful transition of power at the start of Jefferson's term, and that's really important because it does set a really good precedent for the new nation, right? We have the Federalists losing authority, losing control, and they willingly step aside and allow the new party to take over. That's just a rendition of the Capitol building. Obviously, like I said, it doesn't look exactly like that today, but that's because the War of 1812 is going to damage it. While Jefferson is in office, the first thing that needs to be covered is Marbury versus Madison. So Adams, upon leaving office, Adams appoints what are called the midnight judges. And I don't remember the number offhand, but basically there was a Judiciary Act that was created. The Federalists had passed it. Adams goes to fill all of these jobs because he wanted to fill them with Federalists, with people that had a like sort of mindset. And as he's signing all of these, literally, I mean, we call them the midnight judges. I mean, he's signing these orders the night he is leaving the White House, right? Jefferson takes over the next morning, and Madison is his Secretary of State. They basically decide that they're not going to give those people the jobs. They're not going to send them out. And so it ends up in the Supreme Court. And John Marshall, who is a Federalist, it's important to understand that Marshall is a Federalist. The guys that were supposed to get these jobs were Federalists, but Marshall utilizes some legal doctrine to basically say that the Judiciary Act was illegal, that it was unconstitutional, and we establish officially this concept of judicial review in Marbury versus Madison that is wildly important for you to understand. some of the economic policies while Jefferson's in office. He actually keeps with some of the economic policies of the Federalists, right? He doesn't kill the national bank, but he does reduce it. So there's not sort of wholesale or massive changes. It's more of a tweak. Jefferson himself was not a fan of the bank, and so the very fact that he kept it sort of shows a willingness for him to sort of learn and see different viewpoints, and he does come to sort of realize that it does play a significant role in the financial dealings of the nation. The Barbary Pirates, right? The burning. So the United States ends up in a conflict with Barbary pirates off the coast of Tripoli, which is in northern Africa. And so the U.S. is, as this new early nation, they don't necessarily command the respect of other nations. And so our shipping, our international business isn't respected for the most part. And so it's during Jefferson's presidency here that the United States Marines actually end up in northern Africa fighting in Tripoli. It actually ends up becoming a part of the Marine Corps anthem as a result of this. The Louisiana Purchase is made during Jefferson's presidency, and it should be understood that the Louisiana Purchase was actually sort of a moral dilemma for Jefferson. Jefferson makes the Louisiana Purchase while Congress is not in session, and Jefferson doesn't really have the authority to do that constitutionally, because Congress controls financial issues. And so the Louisiana Purchase is politically and constitutionally sort of a problem for Jefferson. But he realizes the importance. He basically utilizes something called the Necessary and Proper Clause to do what's in the best interest of the nation. We buy all of this from the French because the French need the money. Napoleon needs the money because Napoleon's basically dealing with his own sort of insurrection in France and his own issues in France and his own issues with the British. So he needs the money. We send Lewis and Clark, and I'm sure you heard about this in grade school, like the common story. They pick up Sacagawea as sort of a guide and go up the Mississippi because New Orleans is really New Orleans is sort of the crown jewel of the Louisiana Purchase. New Orleans is a massive port, but they go up the Mississippi, and then they go west into sort of the northern central United States and northwestern United States. They end up in the Pacific a little over 2 years after they start trying to map and I forget the name of cartography, I think is the name of it. Yeah, the creation of maps and sort of seeing what the United States purchased as a result of this. The election of 1800, we'll get with that with the political schemes here. So I told you that it went to the House of Representatives, and it went to the House because of the way that we conducted elections at the time. So Burr and Jefferson basically both received the same number of votes. The Federalists are obviously opposed to both. Hamilton is fairly influential amongst the Federalists, and he throws his lot to Jefferson, which ultimately leads to Jefferson becoming president over Aaron Burr. Burr challenges Hamilton to a duel. I'm sure you've seen the Broadway play by now, right? No? Y'all haven't seen Hamilton yet? Okay, we're going to watch Hamilton in here then over finals week. Because your finals were the week before high school finals. So for high school finals, we're watching Hamilton. But Hamilton and Burr duel. Aaron Burr, just so you understand, Aaron Burr is the vice president of the United States, and he gets into a fight and shoots Alexander Hamilton and kills him. Okay, so and then not that you need to know this, but because of some of the political contentiousness of the time, the Democratic Republicans actually try to impeach a Supreme Court justice that was a Federalist. And Aaron Burr, because he's the vice president, presides over the Senate, and the trial occurs in the Senate. And so basically it becomes like this sort of comical farce that you have a murderer like trying a justice. Like the criminal is trying the judge, which is a little comical in terms of like politics. Yeah. So this is just the sort of map of the Louisiana Purchase and where they went. Jefferson gets a second term. There is a little bit of contentiousness amongst Democratic Republicans themselves. But Jefferson is still prominent enough and well enough perceived amongst his party that he is reelected. The Burr conspiracy, again, because of the duel, Burr is out. He is not brought back as vice president. And we think of that as being like ridiculously, like we would think of it today, like if Donald Trump dropped Mike Pence from the ticket, we would think of that as like some sort of huge scandal. That wasn't necessarily the case way back when. FDR had multiple vice presidents. It wasn't necessarily as uncommon. We do, under Jefferson, end the importation of slaves. And so it is important for you to note sort of historically, because obviously slavery is a significant issue. It's a blight in American history. It's something that obviously we recognize today is terrible and catastrophic. And as much as slavery is a significant sort of issue and a contentious point for the first 100 years of American history, there are some theories and some beliefs that our founders really did want to sort of get rid of slavery and try to figure a way out of that. And so Jefferson, a slave owner, ends the slave trade in 1808. We stop importing African slaves at that point. Now that's going to cause some other issues down the road, because then you're going to get some of your southern colonies, but not deep southern states, but not deep south states like Virginia, that are going to ultimately get accused of basically breeding slaves for the sake of selling them into the deep south to pick cotton, because we cannot import any more slaves. During Jefferson's presidency, there is a war in Europe. The French Revolution, there's some conflict between Britain and France. And like I said, this is why Napoleon needs the money. We do end up with some issues. We try to stay neutral for the most part. But we do end up with some issues due to a policy or term called impressment. And impressment is basically where the British would stop U.S. merchant vessels and then basically just take the sailors and put them in the British Navy, which we would think of as sort of ridiculous today because they're not even of that nation. But ultimately, that's going to lead to a response and some increased some conflict between the United States and Britain, right? So the Chesapeake was a U.S. vessel that was basically seized and boarded by the British Navy, that led to the embargo, which is a way of stopping trade. Although ultimately the embargo hurts the United States really more than it hurts Britain, because we need to trade with them more than they need to trade with us. Jefferson serves his 2 terms and then leaves, doesn't seek re-election in 1808, and James Madison is going to take over. And at this point, we're slowly drifting into war, into what will be the War of 1812. Jefferson wasn't always well perceived or well liked. There's some significant anti-Jefferson sentiment. Jefferson had been, earlier in his career, he had been the ambassador to France. And so there were some Americans that felt that Jefferson was actually a little too friendly with the French, and that he allowed the French to sort of dictate policies within his administration. So this all brings us to the War of 1812. The War of 1812 is actually sometimes referred to as the second War of Independence, right? So again, we're fighting the British. Some of the British come down from Canada, and obviously the British still control Canada, so it's very easy for them to move troops and resources into Canada and come south. Obviously, the causes for this, the impressment was part of it. There was also some remaining underlying tension between the United States and Canada, the United States and England. Some of the war hawks, and that's a name that will be used over and over and over again in U.S. history. Those are the people that advocate for sort of a military decision or military intervention. They actually wanted to see the United States take all of Canada and take all of North America. So never mind. You don't know that movie from the 80s, but there was a movie like from the 80s where the U.S. invades Canada. There's also a South Park movie about a war with Canada. No? Okay. At least you know what South Park is. The Battle of Tippecanoe is important because it's going to lead to sort of the rise of William Henry Harrison, who's going to become president of the United States later on. But the Native American conflicts at the time are still, the Native Americans are basically still being sort of used as pawns in all of this. So not that you need to know this is Canadian history, right? But like the Hudson Bay Company. So the Hudson Bay is that massive bay up there in Canada, right? The Hudson Bay Company is basically a British company that engages in like trapping and like fur trade. And they actually have fairly good relations with Native Americans, and they operate on like outposts. And so the British have decent Native American relations, at least in some regards, in which case they're able to sort of manipulate some Native American tribes into being pawns in the war. The war preparations are a little dicey to begin with. The U.S. doesn't do real well in the War of 1812 to start with. Our existing army is pretty weak and not necessarily well trained. Congress doesn't really provide a lot of financial support for the war early on either. The fronts, the Southeast, the Sea, and the Great Lakes, there are 3 different regions in which the fighting occurs. Again, the war in the North is a chance or an opportunity to actually fight the sort of Canadian British rather than British regulars. And so there's an idea of invading Canada, and whether or not the United States should try to take over and annex Canada and make it a part of the United States. In the southeast, the southeast becomes fairly substantial as well, as far as fronts go. Andrew Jackson ultimately becomes significant in this regard, and he uses sort of his heroic persona from the War of 1812 to further his ambitions, and will actually become president of the United States based upon that. Fighting in the Chesapeake, the British are successful. They were actually fairly successful in a lot of it. So, I mean, even 1814, the British are on in some levels winning the war. They attempt to capture a fort in Maryland. They're trying to sack D.C. They burn the White House. And that's actually where the Star Spangled Banner comes from, like our national anthem written by Francis Scott Keyes. He was actually on a prison ship in the Chesapeake Bay watching. So if you look at the first verse of the national anthem, right, that's literally him in the prison ship, like watching, right, watching as the bombs are bursting in the air, and you see these, you know, the flashes from the cannon fire and whatnot. But the whole time he still sees the flag. It didn't fall. The British didn't actually take it and run the American flag down and run the British flag up. This is just some of the major campaigns. You can look through those on your own if you'd like, right? There's the Southern campaigns. The War of New Orleans is at least worth noting, because it's really where Jackson becomes most prominent. And ironically, Jackson is successful in the Battle of New Orleans, which takes place after the war is over, because the Treaty of Ghent is negotiated. And then by the time that information makes it to the United States, the Battle of New Orleans has happened. Basically, the Treaty of Ghent just maintains the pre-war status. So everything sort of reverts back to where it was. It's maybe a little bit more of a British victory than the first the first war, right? The American Revolution. And so after this, British and American sort of relations are going to improve. I think the fact that we're able to withstand the British Army twice gives them a fair amount of respect for the U.S., and they begin to treat the U.S. more as sort of an equal than like a petulant child, which is probably what they did beforehand. A number of the Federalists are disgruntled by all of this, right? And so the Hartford Convention is basically them coming up with a list of demands from the southern states. And the idea is if those demands are not met, the Hartford Convention, and Hartford is in Connecticut, it's actually an early attempt at secession, right? And so a lot of times, obviously, we talk about the Civil War. We'll get to the Civil War, and we know that the South tries to secede from the Union. But the Hartford Convention is actually a northern secession attempt. Although, interestingly enough, those demands arrive in D.C. the same time as the news of the victory of New Orleans does. And so the Federalists, they lose a significant amount of their, pull. Right, like they're anti-war people that think that the Democratic Republicans are running the country poorly. Here's all their demands. Yet as soon as they list their demands, as soon as their demands reach DC, so does the news of the Battle of New Orleans and the end of the war. And now all of a sudden the Federalists are like, we don't have a leg to stand on anymore. All right. This is just a rendition of the defense of New Orleans, which again goes down in folklore. Again, ironically, it's sort of seen as the battle that secures the victory, despite the fact that the War of 1812 ends officially on Christmas Eve in 1814, and this battle doesn't take place until January of 1815. But so that takes us to the end of the War of 1812. That takes us to the end of this chapter. Y'all have a quiz due tonight. And then we'll have one more chapter and your test. Oh no, you got like 2 weeks until you take a test. Oh, I can't. It's because we're not testing on the 14th. Y'all have to take the PSAT on the 14th. That's why. Just the juniors.